You're listening to Talk Radio Europe.
Let's talk.
Time is exactly 11:30. Don't forget, we're going live to Stephen Ritson for Europe Today at 12 o'clock. Resistance money, Bitcoin, isn't just for criminals, speculators, or wealthy Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Despite what the headlines say, resistance money, a philosophical case for Bitcoin, begins by explaining why Bitcoin was invented, how it works, and where it fits in amongst other kinds of money. Delighted to say that I'm joined live on the line by the author of Resistance Money. It's Andrew M. Bailey. Andrew, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning to you, Giles, and thanks for having me.
Pleasure is all mine. For those who maybe have got a passing sort of knowledge of Bitcoin, it may seem that it sort of made the headlines in classic boom stroke bust. Everybody was getting in on it. Some people were making a lot of money. People's gardeners and were getting involved with it. And then the bad headlines started, and as we always see, the papers picked up on it and said, "Oh, this is being used by drug lords. It's being used to wash money through, and it really shouldn't be trusted." Your book goes to perhaps strip it all back to basics and get away from the hype.
That's right. And one thing that we found when doing the research is that beyond the hype, there's actually something quite real, that Bitcoin is being used by real people to evade authoritarian rule, to escape from crushing inflation, and to actually find freedom in the world that they can't get where they are. And I think it's tempting for people in Western Europe or liberal democracies like the United States, or even where I am in Singapore, to dismiss this because we have access to very good monies. The Singapore dollar, the British pound, the US dollar. Say what you will about them, they're actually okay. But a great many people in the globe don't have access to high quality currencies, and Bitcoin is there for them. And it still works. Despite the boom and bust headlines, it sort of chugs along and provides a service to the world.
What's your relationship then with Bitcoin? What's your background with it, if you will? Were you one of the first to recognize the potential? How did you come across Bitcoin and realize and recognize it's not just a way of transferring money? It is, as you said, you've got a philosophical case for this.
At first, I had some just as a kind of plaything, a toy, and maybe as a speculative investment, kind of like a gamble. But it looked to me and my co-authors, these were friends of mine who were similarly into Bitcoin, that this was actually something interesting and kind of puzzling. How does this actually work? And is it really different from ordinary bank accounts? And the deeper we got, the more we found something there that wasn't well understood and well covered by what you see in the headlines, which, as you say, fixate on the boom-bust cycle, use by criminals, and so on. And so that just led us to say, okay, we've got to do research on this. We've got to dig in deep. And we've taken a reputational hit in academia for doing this. People think we're scammers or whatever, but it's just too interesting to ignore. Bitcoin is too important to ignore.
Well, I have had a passing interest in just seeing it come through, and obviously working in the media, there's been a lot of speculation about this, or a lot of some people saying, get involved with it. It's going to change the way we do money. And I was at a friend's birthday party, and he's a musician, so there was a lot of everybody was playing gigs, and I got cornered by a very tech friend of mine, and he said to me, and he literally cornered against the wall and saying, "You've got to get involved with this, because what it's doing is it's not all about the boom and the bust headlines, but it's getting away from the established, and some would say sort of entrenched views about how we view money and how we do business, and why should other institutions have access to our money when, in fact, we are letting them, we are giving them a service and they're giving us nothing back apart from bank charges."
I think that feeling is shared widely in the post-Great Financial Crisis world, and again in the post-COVID world, where the response to COVID was monetary policy that consisted more or less in printing more money. And then we see the result of that, inflation. And so, of course, then the interest rates get cranked up to respond. So we have this sort of gyrating back and forth in monetary policy in the traditional world. Meanwhile, Bitcoin has a monetary policy that's very simple. It's just a fixed supply, and no one is really at liberty to change that. So it's an alternative that you can opt into if you wish, that's fundamentally different than what's on offer in the traditional system. That doesn't mean that it's for everyone in our view, but we think that it's still useful for some, especially those who suffer under the most incompetent of central banks.
So for those who are listening and don't have a clue, I mean, they've heard of Bitcoin, they've heard of cyber currencies. Just give me, if you can, Andrew, just give me a quick Bitcoin 101.
Digital money isn't very special or new. Digital money on computers, has existed longer than I've been alive. I'm 40 this year. So that's not what makes Bitcoin special. What makes it special is that it's digital money that can't be easily controlled by centralized parties because there's no one central server or computer that runs the whole thing or one regulator that has control of the whole thing. Instead, Bitcoin is a system that's distributed across many different computers across the entire internet. There's something like 50,000 Bitcoin nodes that jointly run the network. So instead of a centralized server controlling everything where it's under the thumb of banking authorities or regulators, it's the users themselves who operate the network and who together control the flow of currency and what it does without the cooperation or control of authorities.
It's interesting you mentioned because this is the whole philosophical debate about this, because you mentioned being under central control and having incompetence of central banks. And when you look at the way that certain sections of the media and authorities have clamped down on, there's two aspects. This is a double-pronged attack, if you will. So on the one hand, you have newspapers reporting or media reporting on the potential for scams and the potential for money washing, and this isn't safe, and you got to be careful, and there are schemes, and he lost millions of Bitcoin. And when Bitcoin goes down or has a readjustment, then it's all, so-and-so lost millions and life savings on their Bitcoin. And obviously it is in the interests of the banking institutions and the central governments to have all that money controlled by them and not going out there, heaven forfend that the people themselves can actually control their own money.
One thing that makes our book distinctive is that we're not utopians about Bitcoin. You pointed out correctly that it can be used for scams. Yes. Bitcoin is in fact quite useful for some kinds of criminals. Yes. And in fact, if it wasn't used by criminals, that would show or suggest that it's not actually this freedom money that is different than what came before. So the very fact that it's used by criminals shows that it's what we say it is, which is resistance money. That's the title of the book. So we don't want to diminish or downplay the downsides of what Bitcoin does to the world. And you're right, there are actually risks for users as well. Bitcoin has a distinctive and repetitive boom-bust cycle. It's happened something like 4 or 5 times already. Right now, we're in the middle of a boom, and if patterns continue, there will be a bust, too. But despite all of that, those who've patiently held have done all right. Now, the book isn't about investment advice. It's more about whether this is good for the world or not. And we think having an opt-in system where those who need it can have access to this alternative makes the world better, especially for the least well-off among us.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? If you are in an emerging nation, or perhaps in not one of the most developed places in the world, Bitcoin presumably is a far better place to have at least some of your portfolio than in those establishments that can be, we talk people say about, Bitcoin's being used by criminals. But if you look at some of the ways that national banks have been embezzled or hacked into, or other schemes like that, I mean, it's another option. It's another string to your bow, isn't it, in terms of your portfolio options?
That's right. And of course, many people worldwide would love to have access to the US dollar or the euro. Say what you will about those currencies, they're better than most. And many would love to have access to them, but don't. But Bitcoin, you can't block someone's access to Bitcoin very easily because there isn't a central party controlling the whole thing. And that makes it special and quite distinctive, we think.
One of the other things that people maybe haven't had a handle on is the environmental impact or lack of it on that Bitcoin sort of puts out. So just talk me through the environmental benefits or otherwise of Bitcoin.
One of the big concerns about Bitcoin is that it does use lots of energy. And that indeed is true. So we spent a lot of time in the book working through the data on this. And one thing we found is that, yes, Bitcoin uses a lot of energy, but the negative effects that are alleged to have happened as a result of this, carbon emissions, have been widely exaggerated. In fact, Bitcoin has some features, some peculiar economic features that make it self-decarbonizing in a way. Here's why. Miners, those are the people who are bundling and publishing new Bitcoin transactions, and they're using all the energy. It's their servers that people complain about as using all this energy. Miners compete across the world to do this, which means they're driven to find the cheapest electricity. They're driven to the edges of energy markets in both space and time. Now, what is the cheapest electricity available? 3 cents per kilowatt hour, or 2, or 1. As it happens, that is our greenest energy. So the nature, the economics of the Bitcoin mining has pushed it to the edges of those markets. So they use the energy that's not being used by people. So for example, when people are asleep, or it's being used far away from population centers, sitting on top of a hydro dam that's not near a population center yet. People haven't built up around it yet to use that unharnessed energy. So what we've seen empirically is that Bitcoin's carbon emissions associated with mining are actually going down over time relative to the size of the network. And it is less carbon intensive than any other major energy guzzling energy industry that we know of, compared to things like aluminum smelting, auto manufacture, and so on. So though there are real concerns here, we think they're actually exaggerated, and the trend line is moving in the right direction. So that's very encouraging.
Do you think that perhaps what we've seen so far and what we've been reported are merely the growing pains of something that is going to be an integral part of our lives as we move further into the century? Because no new invention or no new system comes in without a hitch, without a glitch, or without, if you like, a realignment. So what we've seen with the way that the market has how Bitcoin has performed is merely the growing pains of a system.
I think you're right when it comes to Bitcoin's price. That's Bitcoin becoming or being monetized. It's coming into being over time. But I actually don't think that it'll become an integral part of the system for most people. I think if I had to predict Bitcoin's future, it's more that it will remain a niche money because not everybody actually needs it. People who have access to higher quality currencies can use those. For example, you probably, if you have a salary, you draw it in euros or pounds or something like that. I draw a salary in Singapore dollars. I'll continue to do so. But I suspect that authoritarians will also continue to exist in the world and try to block people from making transactions and block dissidents and reporters from receiving donations and block whistleblowers from spending money and so on. And so for those people on the margins, there's still a use for Bitcoin. But that's a niche case. So some Bitcoin pumpers will predict that it's the future of money, that it'll take over the world, that it will become the dominant reserve currency. Well, dude, Bitcoin's 15 years old. It hasn't done that yet. So I think if that was going to happen, we probably would have already seen signs of it by now. But that just doesn't look true to me. So what's more likely and maybe more sober is that though Bitcoin is good for the world, has these good properties, let's get real, dude. It's a niche money for very specific purposes and not for others. And so that's why we call it resistance money in the book. It's for those who need to resist.
And that's perhaps one of the more sobering things about this book is the fact that it's not evangelical saying this is going to change the whole world, way we do business, and it's going to, it's going to free up everything. It looks at why it is particularly appropriate for certain specific niches. As you said, if you draw a salary, perhaps it's not for you. But if you want to get money to somewhere that doesn't have the same freedoms as perhaps we do in our part of the world, at least, then it will be invaluable. What was your starting point then? Because you haven't done this work on your own, because it's quite a big work. So you've Bradley and Craig, you mentioned our colleagues who've had experience. So what was the original concept? Because you don't just sort of pile into this sort of research without a clear plan.
That's right. We had this fantasy that it would start as an article. And of course, it became much bigger than an article. So we begged our editor, can we make it a 2-part series? The editor said yes. But there's no way we could fit our ideas into 2 parts. So it grew and grew and then became a book. And now we're already dreaming of sequel articles to the book as well. I'm glad that you said that about the book's moderate tone and how it's different from Bitcoin pumpers. And that really, for us, is a distinctive thing. We're not here to sell Bitcoin to people. We don't say that you should invest in it, but we do say that it makes the world better and that it deserves careful attention to actually have a sober look at the costs and the benefits and to weigh them against each other, not just caring about you and whether it's useful for you, but thinking about whether it's useful for anyone else as well.
What do you hope that people will take and will learn from this? Is it perhaps a look beyond the hype and a sort of, a cool-headed appraisal perhaps of what Bitcoin is and what it can and what it cannot do?
That's exactly right. We're, at the end of the day, philosophy professors, and our job is to have cool heads. Now, despite that, we did try to make the book exciting. Bitcoin is full of weirdos, that world. So we found the funniest and weirdest stories that we could and peppered the chapters with those. So though it is cool-headed and though we're philosophers who are trying to help people sort through the evidence and make up their own minds, we also want to have fun along the way. So we did the best we could to find engaging stories to pull people in and help them see both what Bitcoin is doing to the world, but also sort of the fun and weird side of Bitcoin as well, which is undeniable and part of its charm and allure.
You just mentioned two of my favorite words when it comes to radio broadcasting, fun and weird. So, come on, Andrew, tell me, just pick either a weird or fun one from the book that you can share with myself and the listeners.
Well, there's this interview with Joe Rogan. I forget who this was. I believe it was a wrestler. We start chapter 7 with this. And this guy was talking about when he would cross this border, the games he would play to hide gold from the guards, immigration officers crossing the border, basically hiding gold in his butt. And he was going on and on about this. And Joe Rogan, in his interview, was flabbergasted, like interested in asking all these prurient questions about it. And then we turned to, well, here's how you can do it with Bitcoin. You don't have to hide your Bitcoin in your butt. It's actually hidden in mathematical space when you just can remember the password to your Bitcoin, the secret or private keys that control it. So it kind of updates that classic way of smuggling something across the border and puts it into the digital realm. There's also a famous Bitcoin thief, or it's a duo, a married couple who stole billions of dollars of Bitcoin. And one of them, what was her name? Rebecca Morgan, I think was her name. She was a rapper named Razzle Khan. So we quote some of her lines, which are absolutely absurd and ridiculous. She actually rapped about how she stole Bitcoins, and then she was caught by U.S. authorities for stealing Bitcoins.
Oh,
the world is full of wild stuff. We tried to capture a bit of that flavor in the book for readers who aren't just eggheads like us.
You may be an egghead, but you're a very entertaining egghead, and you've got a very interesting look of a couple of guitars behind you on the Zoom. So that's good in my book. The book is called Resistance Money: A Philosophical Case for Bitcoin. It is by Craig Warnke, Bradley, and I can't see from Bradley Rita and Andrew M. Bailey. Andrew, if people want to find more information about you or about the book, where's the best place to go?
It's easy. The book's name is Resistance Money, and the website is resistance.money. And you can find links there to the Amazon page, to other articles we've written, to find the authors on Twitter, and so on. I'd love to hear from any readers or potential readers. Resistance.money.
And you'll be able to also order the book via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called Resistance Money. One of the authors is Andrew M. Bailey. Andrew, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Giles. A pleasure.
Talk Radio Europe.